I do want to talk about the sort of elephant in everyone's room right now, the political landscape, which continues to evolve, and the compensation committee is not immune to that. So talking about some aspects of that, and I'll just throw out a few, and you may have others that you find you're facing in the boardroom. David, do you see focus on ESG for performance goals evolving, and if so, how?
So there is some evolution. For oil and gas companies, ESG is really E, right? So and those kind of measures are staying in incentive plans, often pretty formulaic. The weight's not increasing, but it's clear, we hear when clients go out to talk to shareholders, somebody always wants to talk about the climate plan or what they're doing on that part of ESG, whether they've got it in incentive plans or not. And so, 5, 10, 15, 20% of the annual incentive plan may have some of those environmental metrics in there to signal to the organization and to your shareholders that this is important. I think where most of the evolution is happening is on the S and the G, and DE&I in particular. And there are some high-profile, like Starbucks took it out of their annual incentive plan completely. I don't think that's the norm. I think the norm is that if it's something you decided was important enough to have there in the incentive plan, maybe it gets moved to a more qualitative component, where you don't have specific numbers or quotas attached to it, and you're really making a judgment about moving things further along in some things that you think are strategically important for the development of your culture, talent strategy, all of that. So those are still in incentive plans in some form generally. And if you look at the activist proposals from this proxy season, there were a lot more anti-ESG proposals than we've seen before. But the level of support for them is very low, like much lower than for the ESG proposals as a whole. And I think that just indicates that while there's pushback on it, it's very hard to come in and say, I don't think that's important, and I want to take it out completely. So,
do you have any follow-up on that?
No, I think in energy ESG. I was at the Pareto conference in Norway 3 years ago, and somebody stood up, a Norwegian stood up, and said ESG is dead. And I wanted to go over and kiss him, and I didn't because I felt good. Because I'm like David. What's really important for us is the E, and working globally, the S, in terms of you have to get involved in all the communities in which you work, and some areas with tribes with which you work, and all that. So, but I don't, I'm certainly not being talked about in any boardroom that I'm in all that much.
Same here.
So Mark, as you look to the future, how do you think compensation arrangements will be impacted by political and perhaps tax changes?
Well, I guess it depends on who takes the White House, right? I think, to sort of kind of come at it from two aspects. One, if there's a Democratic win, right, there's been a lot of discussion about the wealth tax. And, I don't know if everybody's thought through that, right? But, we spend a lot of our time, thinking about long-term compensation plans around stock accumulation, stock options, that out there. And of course, if all of a sudden, there's a wealth tax that comes in and starts wanting to tax those compensation schemes, it feels like we're going to have to rethink how we think about and do long-term comp. Because the stock plans, unless we do some kind of current tax protection, it's not going to work very well. So I haven't figured that one out. I just sort of see that as a potential issue on the horizon if that's the way that it goes. On the opposite side, a lot of discussion about, starting to peel back some of the safety net programs that I think, while we don't talk about that, it's not really tied into our executive comp. It is. The compensation committee still has responsibility for looking at the care and feeding of the larger compensation programs from the employee base overall. And we've, for a long time, sort of leaned back and said, well, the government's going to take care of it. So we can just sort of push everybody into 401k, and we can, that they can deal with their own medical programs, post-retirement, whatever. And I feel like that if some of those start getting peeled away, there's going to be increasing pressure on the corporate community to start coming back and rethinking how we think about sort of building in programs for our employees when they retire, whether that's a pension plan, a defined pension plan, or some kind of medical programs or whatever that reach. If they move the retirement ages, there's all sorts of things that could happen, and I don't know where it's going to go, but it certainly feels that there's some pressure there that might build.
Reading through a couple of questions here, I want to kind of segue a little bit to some other topics. One is a question we've received that says unions are less prevalent in energy, but recently they flexed their muscle, Boeing, automakers, longshoremen. Are there lessons from union engagement that would be helpful for non-union companies, and how does the compensation committee fit in?
My only union negotiations have been in places like Brazil, West Africa, in other countries, not ever in the U.S. And those are very interesting. But you have to, it's part of what you have to do in certain countries. But I don't know. I don't know that I would have any advice for anyone. I mean, in terms of unions and the U.S. unions, I've never had to fight that battle.
You certainly often see that CEOs become very much of a boogeyman in the union versus the company.
Right.
And how do you look at sort of evaluating the performance of the CEO if the unions go sideways?
Yeah, I've never had any experience with this, so it's kind of a new thing. It's it clearly, I think the comp committee has to step in and take a role, and sort of making sure that both sides play nice. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the CEO, the management team, particularly if you've got to our earlier question about whether there's a fairly huge gap in CEO comp, or or there's a different experience that the management team is than the rank and file are receiving, that can really create a lot of animosity that just they're not going to get to a good conclusion. But I think that it's sort of, you got to monitor, right? Just got to get the right people in the room. I do think to this earlier question about the political, right, that the pressure for unions could increase, right? If all of a sudden you got safety net programs falling apart, I think people are going to say, hey, wait a second, this isn't working for me. So